Tonight, we're covering one of the darkest and most haunting chapters in London's modern history, the Great Smog of 1952. This terrifying and tragic event shrouded the city in a deadly fog, claimed thousands of lives, and changed the way the world thinks about air pollution forever. A silent killer, born from smoke, coal, and cold weather, brought London to a standstill and left behind lessons still remembered today. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's step quietly back into those cold and shadowed streets, and begin our story. We hope it not only teaches you something new, but also helps you gently drift to sleep. London, December 1952. The city thrummed quietly beneath its familiar canopy of winter grey. Chimneys puffed endlessly, their plumes merging with the heavy sky. Streets buzzed with the usual end-of-year anticipation. Christmas lights flickered, vendors called from behind stalls, and Londoners, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, hustled through the cold, unaware that they stood on the precipice of disaster. The war had ended 7 years earlier, yet signs of recovery still mixed with scars of the past. Bombed-out buildings lined familiar roads. Rationing lingered, and coal, particularly the cheap, sulfur-heavy variety, was the lifeblood of domestic comfort. It burned in hearths across the city, choking the skies day and night with soot and smoke. The smell of burning coal had long been woven into the city's essence. Londoners accepted it as a fact of life. But nature was about to turn that familiar nuisance into something far more sinister. On December 4th, a high-pressure weather system drifted in quietly, invisible yet powerful. It brought with it a phenomenon few truly understood at the time, a temperature inversion. Warmer air aloft settled like a lid atop cooler air at ground level, trapping everything below it. Smoke, vehicle exhaust, and industrial pollutants that would normally drift upward now collected steadily at street level. It was subtle at first. The sky merely looked duller, the air a touch heavier. By the morning of December 5th, however, that subtlety vanished. Fog began to roll in thick and fast. But this was no ordinary fog. It mixed with the trapped pollution, turning dense, soupy, and unrelenting. It was yellowish in hue, sour on the tongue, and so heavy that visibility in parts of the city fell to mere feet. To some, it felt almost alive, seeping into homes, drifting beneath doors, and clinging to curtains. People lit lamps indoors during the day. Cars crept along at walking pace. Even familiar routes became treacherous mazes. At first, no one panicked. Londoners were no strangers to pea soupers, the thick, yellow-brown fogs that had plagued the city for centuries. These fogs had been immortalized in novels and paintings, and were even considered part of London's mystique. But by midday, it was clear this fog was unlike anything in living memory. It grew denser and more oppressive with every passing hour. Soon, life ground to a halt. Buses and taxis stopped running entirely. Ambulances could not navigate the near-total blindness of the streets. People became stranded in shops, stations, and workplaces. Horses were used in some parts of the city to guide ambulances or carry essential goods, a ghostly sight that felt ripped from another century. Yet, the danger was not only in what people could see, or rather, could not see. Hidden within the smog was a deadly cocktail of pollutants. Sulfur dioxide levels skyrocketed, combining with airborne particles to form a toxic brew that attacked the lungs with every breath. People coughed violently. Eyes watered and throats burned. For the very young, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions, the air became almost impossible to endure. Still, officials hesitated to sound the alarm. Initial explanations from authorities pointed to a possible influenza outbreak to explain the growing number of deaths. But behind closed doors, experts began to realize the awful truth. The smog was not merely an inconvenience. It was a killer. By the time night fell again, the city was trapped under an eerie, almost apocalyptic veil. Lamplight and neon signs barely penetrated the gloom. Street corners vanished into darkness. London had gone dark, not in power, but in spirit and in life. And yet, the worst had only just begun. By dawn on December 6th, London had become a city frozen in uneasy stillness. The great smog had settled deeper overnight, thickening into an almost tangible wall. From shopkeepers to students, from bus drivers to businessmen, all found themselves prisoners within their own streets. Visibility was now so poor that even familiar paths seemed alien. Pedestrians stumbled cautiously through their neighborhoods, often guided only by touch or the faint glow of gas lamps that struggled in vain against the suffocating haze. Daily life began to disintegrate. Streets emptied as the smog tightened its grip, yet homes fared no better. Inside, windows became smeared with grime. Curtains were drawn in hopes of keeping the poisonous air at bay, but it seeped through every crack and crevice. Families huddled around their radios, which became lifelines to the outside world, offering weather reports that sounded more desperate with every passing hour. Transportation, the lifeblood of London, came to a virtual standstill. Underground trains still ran, but reaching the stations was treacherous. On the surface, drivers abandoned their cars. Even experienced bus conductors and cabbies refused to venture into the near-zero visibility. Boat traffic on the Thames ceased. Air travel? Impossible. The city was effectively cut off, a metropolis silenced by nature and circumstance. For those brave enough or forced to venture outdoors, navigating became a nightmare. People tied ropes from shop entrances to lampposts just to guide themselves back inside. Some fashioned makeshift masks from scarves and handkerchiefs, hoping in vain to filter the acrid air. Traffic wardens, reduced to shouting warnings into the gloom, found their voices barely carried more than a few feet. In hospitals and clinics, doctors and nurses operated blindly in poorly lit rooms, treating a flood of patients whose lungs had turned against them. The health crisis was escalating swiftly. Elderly Londoners and those with respiratory problems were the first to suffer. Children wheezed uncontrollably. Reports began filtering in of people collapsing on the streets, their airways choked with soot and sulfur. Emergency rooms became overwhelmed, morgues filled to capacity, and undertakers struggled to keep pace with the rising number of bodies. Animals, too, suffered terribly. Birds were found dead in droves, having collided blindly into buildings they could not see. Livestock in urban and suburban areas fell ill. Even guide dogs, trusted companions to the blind, became disoriented in the unnatural darkness. It was as though the very city had lost all of its senses. Still, the government hesitated. Officials remained cautious in their public statements, unwilling to declare the event a national emergency. Their words rang hollow against the grim reality. Newspapers, though filled with updates and anecdotes, avoided outright panic. London had weathered crises before. The Blitz was still fresh in the collective memory, and there remained an underlying sense of British stoicism among many citizens. But beneath that exterior, fear quietly spread. Funeral directors began to whisper nervously of the scale of death. Crematoriums could not keep up, and burials were delayed. Families waited days to bury loved ones lost to what was still officially described as unseasonably heavy fog. Behind closed doors, health officials began tallying the numbers, and the totals were sobering. Even so, each evening brought new horror. The setting sun offered no respite. Nights were the worst. Without natural light or moonshine, and with street lamps rendered useless, the city descended into utter blackness. Crime rose as thieves exploited the cover. People stumbled through alleys or spent restless nights awake, windows sealed tight, terrified of what morning might bring. London had become an unrecognizable ghost town. Not due to war or economic collapse, but because the very air, the invisible force sustaining life, had turned lethal. And yet, the smog showed no signs of lifting. By the third day, December 7th, the great smog had transformed from a terrifying anomaly into a suffocating nightmare. It was no longer simply unpleasant, it was deadly. The streets of London, once alive with the noise and color of human activity, had become eerily silent. Only the occasional cough or shuffling footsteps broke the stillness as Londoners, masked with scarves or makeshift cloth filters, braved the poison that blanketed their world. Hospitals, already burdened, now found themselves in chaos. Patients with asthma, bronchitis, and heart conditions poured in, gasping for breath. Children clung to their parents, wheezing helplessly. Nurses hurried through dimly lit wards, their faces weary and their uniforms stained with the grime that hung heavy in the air. The staff worked tirelessly, but it was as if they were fighting an invisible monster that grew more ruthless with every passing hour. Doctors, though experienced in wartime medicine, were alarmed by what they were witnessing. Ordinary fogs had always caused discomfort, but never death on this scale. Patients' lungs were literally filling with toxic sludge. Some succumbed quickly, their breathing slowed until it stopped. Others lingered for days, gasping weakly as their bodies fought, and often failed, to survive the relentless assault. Outside hospital walls, conditions grew just as grim. Undertakers, overwhelmed by the growing number of dead, struggled to find space to store the bodies. Morgues ran out of room. Cold storage warehouses were hastily converted to accommodate the mounting toll. Funeral homes faced delays, and grief-stricken families waited in lines that stretched longer with each passing day. At street level, those still able to work tried to carry on, but the struggle was immense. Milkmen and delivery workers found themselves moving blindly through the smog, calling out so they would not collide with unseen walls or people. Shopkeepers opened their doors only to find customers unable or unwilling to venture into the choking gloom. Postal services faltered. Schools that remained open faced absentee rates so high that many simply shut down. For the vulnerable, life became a matter of staying indoors and hoping. Windows were taped shut, and wet towels were pressed against door frames in futile attempts to block the smog's invasion. Families lit fires less often, fearing they were only worsening the foul air. Yet even those precautions proved worthless. The deadly fog crept into homes with the persistence of a living thing. Each breath became a battle. The air, heavy with sulfur and soot, scorched throats and left behind an acidic taste. It settled deep in the lungs, causing intense coughing fits and chest pains. Even healthy adults began to feel the strain. The smog did not discriminate, it attacked the old and young alike. Despite the worsening crisis, authorities still hesitated to act decisively. The government maintained that the fog, though severe, would soon dissipate. Public health officials issued vague warnings, encouraging people to stay indoors and avoid exertion. But there were no emergency broadcasts, no evacuation plans, and no national address. To many, it felt as though the city had been left to fend for itself. And so, Londoners endured. Hour after hour, day after day, they watched the sun struggle in vain to pierce the dense veil. Nights became longer, as darkness fell by mid-afternoon and lingered late into morning. Streetlights, their glow swallowed entirely by the murk, offered no comfort. Hope dimmed with every passing day. The question on everyone's lips, though few dared speak it aloud, was chilling in its simplicity. When, if ever, would this end? As December 8th dawned, the fourth day of the great smog brought no relief. If anything, the poison hanging over London seemed denser, heavier, and crueler. The city had long since surrendered its routines. Shops remained shuttered, trains silent, and streets barren of their usual crowds. London had grown still, but the stillness was not peaceful. It was suffocating. For many, each breath now felt like inhaling fire and ashes. The once invisible air had turned into a visible, suffocating blanket. Those forced outside for essential reasons moved with painstaking care. Some used ropes strung along fences to find their way, while others linked arms in groups, terrified of becoming separated and vanishing into the yellow-black gloom. Stories spread of people getting lost mere steps from their front doors and wandering helplessly for hours in their own neighborhoods. Even indoors, safety proved elusive. Smog seeped relentlessly through every crack, invading living rooms, bedrooms, and kitchens alike. Curtains stained yellow. The faint smell of smoke clung to everything: clothing, furniture, even food. Meals became tasteless, their flavor dulled by the choking air. Boiling water offered little help. There was no escaping the invisible enemy. Animals fared no better. In parks, birds fell from trees or collided blindly into unseen obstacles. Dogs whimpered at doorways, reluctant to go outside. In more rural outskirts, cows and sheep coughed violently, while poultry perished in alarming numbers. The natural world was suffering alongside humankind. As the city gasped, hospitals overflowed. Staff worked through exhaustion, covering multiple shifts without pause. Protective masks, in short supply, were rationed carefully among medical teams. The patients kept coming, elderly men unable to stand, young mothers wheezing as they clutched sick children, and fit men brought low by relentless coughing fits. Doctors began to recognize that many deaths were no longer simply from aggravated bronchitis or pneumonia. The smog itself had become the direct killer. Despite the undeniable severity of the crisis, political leaders remained curiously detached. Parliament debated the issue behind closed doors, reluctant to acknowledge the scale of the disaster publicly. The smog was still officially being referred to in benign terms, adverse weather, or heavy fog. But for the people living within it, there was nothing benign about what was unfolding. In the absence of clear government guidance, Londoners relied on one another. Neighbors shared candles and food. Strangers helped guide the elderly down invisible streets. Makeshift volunteer patrols formed to help escort nurses and doctors to and from their shifts. Despite being wrapped in darkness and despair, the community spirit that had helped London survive wartime raids flickered to life once again. Nevertheless, tempers frayed. Accidents became frequent. Vehicles collided at intersections where drivers could see nothing. Fires broke out as gas lights burned unattended or stoves were left lit overnight, yet firefighters struggled to locate the flames in the haze. Crime rose sharply under the cover of darkness. Assaults, thefts, and even murders became easier to commit and harder to detect. By nightfall on the fourth day, hope was nearly gone. People stared out their windows, praying for the skies to shift. But the smog, unmoved by human suffering, hung stubbornly over the city like a grim shroud. In bedrooms and parlors, Londoners waited with growing despair. Each dawn promised only more darkness. The world outside had vanished into smoke and shadow, and for many, the question had become not when the smog would lift, but if it ever would. As the endless smog tightened its grip upon the heart of London, December 9th arrived with no sign of mercy from the skies. The city, which had once proudly worn its crown as a beacon of civilization and resilience, now appeared fragile and broken beneath the heavy, noxious veil that refused to lift. Morning and evening no longer existed in any meaningful way, as the sun had been swallowed completely, leaving behind only a perpetual, sickly twilight. Clocks became the only means by which Londoners could mark the passage of time, for the natural rhythms of day and night had been entirely consumed by the oppressive haze. Inside homes, once considered sanctuaries against the city's harsh elements, the sense of safety had all but vanished. Families gathered around radios, clinging desperately to news updates that offered little in the way of comfort or guidance. Each bulletin echoed the same cold reality. The smog persisted, unchallenged by weather shifts and untouched by human intervention. In the absence of practical solutions, neighbors became each other's lifelines. Housewives, once concerned with daily chores and preparing winter meals, now spent their time wetting towels and hanging them over windows in futile efforts to block the creeping tendrils of poisoned air. Parents, whose foremost instinct was to protect their children, watched helplessly as little ones coughed through the night, their tiny chests rising and falling with alarming effort. The outside world, which now existed more in memory than in reality, had become a hostile realm of dangers both seen and unseen. The streets that once bustled with laughter and hurried footsteps had turned into desolate corridors of despair, where movement was possible only with extreme caution. Even footsteps sounded different, muffled by the heavy blanket that smothered every surface. Shops stood empty or closed, their owners having long since retreated indoors, while public transport remained a distant dream. The underground railways, though still technically operational, had become ghostly avenues of silent passengers, each one masked with scarves or cloths, staring into the middle distance as if resigned to an existence suspended in limbo. Elsewhere, the suffering grew deeper and more acute. Hospitals, now functioning far beyond their intended capacity, resembled grim fortresses besieged by waves of gasping, desperate patients. Nurses and doctors, many of whom had grown up in the shadow of wartime horrors, admitted quietly to one another that they had never seen anything quite like this. The wards echoed with a chorus of ragged breathing and pitiful cries, while medical staff moved tirelessly from bed to bed, their faces etched with exhaustion and helplessness. Treatments proved frustratingly limited. Oxygen tanks dwindled rapidly, and ventilators of the era were rudimentary at best. Physicians prescribed medications in hopes of easing symptoms, yet the smog outside continued its silent assault, rendering many efforts tragically ineffective. Even more haunting than the visible suffering was the growing awareness that death was spreading quietly but relentlessly through the city's population. Morgues had long since overflowed, and undertakers faced an impossible task. In the absence of space, bodies were stored wherever the cold could slow decay, in warehouses, in garages, and in church crypts that had not been used for burials in generations. Grieving families waited in grim silence, unable to hold funerals while the city remained paralyzed, unable even to properly mourn as death became just another part of the oppressive landscape. In the face of such tragedy, official statements from the government continued to fall woefully short of addressing the enormity of the catastrophe. Politicians avoided acknowledging the smog's lethal nature, clinging instead to bland and inadequate phrases that spoke of persistent fog and unfortunate weather. Their words rang hollow against the stark reality faced by millions each day, and public frustration simmered beneath the surface. In pubs and parlors, hushed conversations turned bitter, as Londoners began to ask the questions their leaders refused to answer aloud. Why had nothing been done? Why had warnings not been issued sooner? And above all, how many more would die before someone took action? As night fell on that dreadful day, London seemed to hold its collective breath. Behind sealed doors, within darkened rooms heavy with the weight of fear and exhaustion, families clung to fragile hopes that the dawn would bring change. But the air remained thick and poisonous, and the city remained silent in its suffering, caught between endurance and despair, awaiting deliverance from a sky that remained pitilessly still. As dawn reluctantly crept across the shrouded city on December 10th, no joyous sunlight broke through to lift spirits, or signify the beginning of a new day. Instead, the same lifeless haze persisted, unchanged and unmoved, as though London itself had been frozen in a grim tableau. The smog, by now deeply woven into every moment of existence, had transcended its physical nature and become something psychological. It was no longer merely a condition of the air. It was a state of mind, a suffocating dread that pressed upon every citizen, waking or asleep. In every neighborhood, from the wealthiest districts to the humblest terraces, the atmosphere was charged with despair and helplessness. The city had grown unnervingly quiet. The usual melody of human life, footsteps hurrying on cobblestones, bells of market stalls ringing, the familiar shouts of street vendors, had all vanished into the all-consuming murk. Even animals, those often unseen cohabitants of city life, had gone silent. Birds no longer sang, dogs rarely barked, and horses, when they did venture outside, moved sluggishly and hesitantly, their handlers whispering softly into the stillness. For many Londoners, the most chilling element of this strange new world was that death itself had become mundane. Stories circulated quickly, spreading as swiftly as the smog itself. People spoke in hushed tones about neighbors who had gone out and never returned, about friends found collapsed in alleyways or slumped quietly in chairs, about children who had gone to bed coughing only to slip silently away before morning. These tales, once shocking, began to feel routine. Every knock on the door could bring news of another passing. Every telephone ring sent chills down spines. Mourning had become something nearly passive, so overwhelming in scope that grief felt diluted by the sheer numbers. While homes had turned into suffocating prisons and hospitals became overcrowded havens for the desperate, outside chaos quietly blossomed. Drivers, forced to brave the streets despite the impossibility of safe passage, collided with walls, other vehicles, or pedestrians, often with tragic consequences. Ambulances, nearly blind as they navigated the labyrinth of invisible roads, failed to reach patients in time. Even police officers, seasoned in handling the darkest days of wartime London, admitted privately that the city had never felt so eerie and alien. Amid this growing sense of societal paralysis, the government's response remained painfully slow and inadequate. Press releases spoke cautiously, their tone one of reluctant acknowledgement rather than urgency. Words like hazardous and unusually persistent were tossed about without conviction. Public addresses avoided admitting that people were dying in unprecedented numbers. Ministers debated behind closed doors, fearful of creating public panic or admitting to the policy failures that had allowed London to become so dependent on dirty fuels. Their inaction and indifference only deepened the gulf between leadership and the populace, leaving many to conclude bitterly that they were on their own. Nevertheless, resilience flickered stubbornly amidst the gloom. Acts of simple kindness and bravery emerged like small beacons of light. Volunteers emerged to escort the sick and elderly to nearby clinics. Families opened their homes to stranded travelers unable to find their way back through the deadly fog. Milkmen and delivery boys, refusing to abandon their routes, navigated blindly to bring necessities to shut-ins who might otherwise starve. These gestures did little to shift the monumental scale of suffering, but they whispered defiantly that humanity had not yet been entirely smothered by the smog. As evening approached once more, it became clear to all that the ordeal had stretched beyond physical endurance and entered a dark realm of psychological torment. London's citizens no longer wondered when the smog would end. That hope had diminished as the days stretched on mercilessly. Instead, a far more terrible thought crept into many minds, spoken aloud only in private moments or restless midnight hours. What if this was permanent? What if the world outside their windows, heavy, dark, and deadly, was no longer a temporary nightmare, but the new and terrible normal? By the morning of December 11th, London's spirit teetered on the edge of collapse. The smog, which had invaded every facet of life, seemed no closer to lifting than it had days before. The city's residents, already battered by a sense of hopelessness and suffocated by the poisonous air, awoke with no expectation that this day would be any different. The very idea of rescue, whether by nature or human intervention, had grown faint and abstract, a distant dream buried under layers of smoke and sorrow. For most, life had been reduced to a simple and brutal equation: survive the next hour, and then the hour after that. Plans were abandoned, schedules forgotten, and calendars irrelevant. Nothing mattered beyond the immediate and desperate task of continuing to breathe. In countless homes across London, fires remained unlit despite the bitter cold, for fear of worsening the deadly air indoors. Meals, often prepared hastily and without enthusiasm, lost their taste as smoke tainted every mouthful. Children, restless and frightened, asked endless questions their parents could not answer. The city felt suspended, as if the entire population were holding its collective breath. In hospitals, now overwhelmed beyond description, exhaustion reigned supreme. Nurses and doctors who had been working without rest for days now moved mechanically, their once purposeful steps reduced to shuffling movements born of sheer necessity. Medical supplies, already stretched thin by years of post-war austerity, dwindled dangerously. Oxygen cylinders ran dry. Morphine and sedatives, in limited supply, were administered sparingly. Physicians faced cruel decisions, prioritizing the youngest and strongest while offering only comfort to those beyond saving. Outside the hospital walls, the death toll climbed steadily and relentlessly, though few still bothered to count. Grief had become part of the city's architecture, layered invisibly over streets and rooftops, present in every home and every whispered conversation. And yet, as that terrible morning wore on, subtle signs began to emerge that hinted at a long-awaited shift. Observant Londoners noticed that, while the fog remained thick and hostile, its movement seemed less stagnant. A faint stirring in the air, imperceptible to most, teased the idea that the weather had grown restless after days of cruel stillness. Birds, which had been eerily silent, began to flutter and call from hidden perches. In distant corners of the city, chimney smoke no longer hung motionless but curled slightly as faint breezes toyed with the soot-laden clouds. By afternoon, what began as a whisper became unmistakable. Winds, long absent, began to stir in earnest. At first they offered little more than a gentle caress, but as hours passed, they gained strength and purpose. Trees, whose skeletal branches had stood rigid and unmoving for days, began to sway softly, as though awakening from a troubled sleep. People stepping outside felt it, a cool, clean touch brushing against their cheeks, pushing back ever so slightly against the oppressive wall of smog. As night approached, the transformation accelerated. The toxic veil, which had smothered the city without mercy, began to thin. Streetlights, long muted and ghost-like, now flickered with renewed clarity. Shapes previously consumed by darkness emerged slowly into view. The outline of rooftops, the faint glow of distant windows, the shimmer of the Thames, all became visible once again as the smog reluctantly surrendered its dominion. In homes, windows long sealed against the noxious air were cracked open hesitantly. Fresh, cool gusts pushed aside the stale remnants of poisonous days. Faces appeared at doorways and on balconies, eyes wide with disbelief. Londoners, who had dared not hope, now felt the burden lifting from their chests, as breaths came easier and the bitter taste in their mouths faded. Tears, a mixture of grief, exhaustion, and relief, streamed freely down many cheeks. Though the winds did not eradicate the smog instantly, pockets of haze lingered into the night. The message was clear and undeniable. Nature, silent and implacable, had finally intervened where human effort had failed. The great smog's reign, which had lasted for nearly 5 harrowing days, was at last breaking. That night, as people drifted into restless sleep, many for the first time in days allowed themselves to believe something truly astonishing. Tomorrow, when they awoke, London might once again be visible, breathable, and alive. The morning of December 12th dawned with a sharpness that felt almost foreign. Where for days only darkness and poison had ruled, now the skies, though still heavy with scattered remnants of haze, stretched clearer than they had in nearly a week. For the first time since the smog had descended, sunlight broke timidly through, painting London in muted, fragile gold. It was as though a curtain had finally lifted after a terrible and prolonged performance. People stepped cautiously outdoors, blinking as though they had awoken from a disturbing dream, their faces etched with fatigue yet softened by profound relief. Throughout the city, the reaction to this change in the air was universal. Children who had been confined indoors laughed quietly as they ventured onto stoops and narrow alleys. Shopkeepers unlocked doors sealed for days, sweeping aside accumulated soot and grime as they prepared to resume something resembling normal business. Public transport roared back to life, though hesitantly. Buses rolled down still-muted streets, drivers waving cautiously to one another, as if confirming the nightmare had truly passed. The river, too, which had become a dark and still ribbon beneath the weight of the smog, stirred gently under the influence of returning winds. Yet even as London exhaled, the scars of the ordeal became undeniable. The evidence of devastation was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the city like invisible ash. Ambulances continued to race through neighborhoods where too many homes now stood silent in mourning. Hospital wards, far from relaxing, found themselves grappling with the sheer volume of patients whose lungs and hearts had been ravaged by days of inhaling the foul air. Doctors noted that though the smog itself had retreated, its damage lingered cruelly within the bodies of those most vulnerable. Reports of the dead began to filter through with grim regularity, each statistic carrying the weight of tragedy. Families posted notices, churches tolled bells without rest, and funeral homes, having already reached capacity days earlier, struggled to meet the growing demand for services. In quieter moments, Londoners shared hushed stories of friends, neighbors, and loved ones lost not to old age or disease, but to the unseen killer that had cloaked the city in darkness. The authorities, slow to act during the crisis, now moved swiftly to control the narrative. Official statements, carefully crafted and meticulously phrased, sought to distance policymakers from blame. Early press briefings continued to use the phrase severe fog, avoiding direct references to pollution, coal smoke, or governmental negligence. Ministers and senior officials emphasized the extraordinary weather conditions, implying that the smog had been an unfortunate act of nature, beyond human control or prediction. Yet not all accepted these explanations so readily. Medical experts, emboldened by the stark evidence before them, began to speak more openly about the true causes of the disaster. Leading physicians and scientists argued persuasively that the lethal cocktail of pollutants trapped by the temperature inversion had been the primary driver of the catastrophe. In their eyes, coal smoke and industrial emissions were not simply contributing factors, they were the direct culprits. Public sentiment, raw and furious after days of abandonment, began to shift. Newspapers that had once treaded carefully now ran sobering headlines. Editorials demanded accountability, asking how a modern, civilized city could have allowed itself to choke in its own filth without warning or preparation. Community leaders organized meetings and public forums where citizens, still grieving and frightened, demanded to know whether such horrors could, or would, happen again. Behind the closed doors of government offices, these calls for justice and change echoed like thunder. Senior officials, recognizing the political danger of appearing indifferent, convened urgent discussions about air quality and public safety. Though immediate promises were scarce and cautious, the seeds of reform had been sown. London could no longer ignore what had transpired. The smog had claimed thousands of lives, shattered families, and scarred the city's psyche. Moving forward without addressing these brutal truths was no longer politically, or morally, tenable. As dusk fell on December 12th, a city forever changed prepared to sleep once more under clearer skies. Yet even in the quiet and stillness, grief and uncertainty lingered. Though the smog itself had retreated into memory, its lessons had only begun to take root. London had survived, but survival alone felt hollow without understanding, and that understanding, at long last, was beginning to dawn. As the days turned to weeks and the great smog of 1952 became part of recent memory rather than immediate terror, London's wounds, though invisible in many ways, became a constant presence. The skies, now restored to their familiar muted gray rather than the choking yellow-black of days prior, seemed almost kind in comparison, yet the collective trauma lingered beneath the surface. Conversations, which had once danced around daily trivialities, now inevitably turned to tales of the smog, not merely as a weather event, but as a shared ordeal that had altered the very character of the city. The dead, once counted cautiously and vaguely, had by now become a grim, undeniable fact. In the immediate aftermath, official figures spoke of around 4,000 fatalities, yet few believed that number captured the true scale of the tragedy. As winter wore on and statisticians and health officials reviewed the data, the horrifying truth began to emerge. Mortality records, usually steady and predictable, revealed a staggering surge during the smog's reign and in the weeks that followed. By the time the full reckoning had concluded, estimates suggested that as many as 12,000 lives may have been claimed by the toxic air, a toll that dwarfed previous fog-related incidents and forced even the most reluctant officials to admit the catastrophe had been unprecedented. For families who had lost loved ones, statistics brought little comfort. Grief coursed through communities. Elderly relatives lost in the night, infants whose lungs could not withstand the poison, and healthy adults struck down seemingly at random. The stories were too numerous and too personal to fade quietly. Black-clad mourners became a common sight across the city's cemeteries, and memorial services echoed week after week with eulogies not for soldiers or victims of war, but for victims of neglect, policy, and pollution. As public anger grew, so too did the pressure upon Parliament. Politicians, who had clung tightly to the narrative of natural disaster, found themselves facing an increasingly informed and outraged electorate. Inquiries were launched to understand the scientific realities of the smog. Expert witnesses described in painstaking detail how sulfur dioxide, combined with soot and fog, had formed deadly particles capable of burrowing deep into human lungs. The evidence, impossible to ignore, painted a damning picture of an industrial system addicted to cheap, dirty fuels without regard for public health. Debates in Parliament turned heated and urgent. Environmental campaigners, whose voices had been marginalized before the disaster, now found themselves at the forefront of national discussions. Newspapers published harrowing personal accounts alongside stark editorials demanding reform. Londoners, once accustomed to tolerating poor air quality as part of urban life, now refused to accept the status quo. The smog had crossed a line. It had not merely inconvenienced or irritated, it had killed. Caught between public fury and undeniable scientific proof, the government could no longer rely on vague promises or gradual change. Action became not only necessary but unavoidable. Thus began the slow and complex path toward legislative reform, culminating in the introduction of the Clean Air Bill. Though its passage would take years and face resistance from industrial interests and traditionalists alike, the momentum was unstoppable. The memory of the smog hung heavy over every debate, its victims silent yet omnipresent in the minds of lawmakers. The proposed legislation called for profound changes. It sought to limit the use of coal in urban areas, promote cleaner fuels, and establish smoke control zones to prevent pollutants from becoming trapped at ground level again. The bill also marked a cultural shift, embedding the idea that governments bore responsibility not only for defending their citizens from foreign threats but also for safeguarding them from dangers born of neglect and ignorance. As winter gave way to spring, London slowly emerged from its long season of mourning. Though the air would never be pristine, and fogs would still haunt the city in the years to come, the nightmare of December 1952 had reshaped the relationship between Londoners and the very air they breathed. It had taught them, at immense cost, that progress without caution could become perilous, and that nature, when provoked, could turn merciless. In the silence of the cleaner skies, one truth now echoed clearly through the city's brick and stone: the days of turning a blind eye to pollution were over. In the years that followed the catastrophic smog of December 1952, London carried on as cities always do, reshaping itself quietly around the scars of past calamities. The soot-stained bricks were scrubbed clean, traffic resumed its endless hum, and new generations of Londoners, unaware of the sharp taste of sulfur that once clung to every breath, grew up beneath gentler skies. Yet even as the smog faded into memory, the legacy of those harrowing days continued to shape the city in profound and permanent ways. The passage of the Clean Air Act of 1956 became more than a political achievement. It stood as a monument to the invisible war waged against the very air people trusted to sustain them. Under the Act's provisions, smoke control zones spread across London and other industrial centers, gradually forcing coal fires to become relics of the past. Homeowners were compelled to adopt smokeless fuels, factories were regulated more tightly, and chimneys that once belched unfiltered pollutants into the heavens fell silent, or were redesigned to release cleaner emissions. While these changes met resistance from industries accustomed to cheap and dirty energy, the public's appetite for reform, sharpened by grief and fear, would not be denied. The transformation of London's air was neither instant nor absolute. Smogs would return occasionally in lesser forms, and the city would continue to wrestle with pollution well into the modern age. Yet the thick, lethal miasmas that once smothered entire boroughs became increasingly rare, and by the late 20th century, the phrase, "pea souper," belonged more to history books and nostalgia than to daily life. The victory, though slow and imperfect, was real. Streets once made impassable by choking fog became safe once again for hurried commuters and carefree children. Still, even as cleaner air flowed through the capital, the story of the Great Smog endured. Historians, scientists, and environmentalists held up the event as a grim warning, a case study in what happens when progress is pursued without foresight or restraint. The smog, after all, had not been the product of a freak accident, or a once-in-a-century weather phenomenon alone. It was a tragedy born of human choices, of policies that prioritized industry over environment, of leaders who had failed to act swiftly even as the skies darkened and the death toll mounted. Survivors of the smog carried the memories within them long after the air had cleared. Older Londoners, recalling the days when sight and breath alike were stolen by invisible killers, told stories to children and grandchildren about walking blindly through silent streets and listening helplessly to the rasping coughs of loved ones through the long, terrible nights. For them, the Great Smog was more than a historical event. It was an intimate chapter of lived experience, a grim echo that surfaced every time winter fog began to roll across the Thames. As decades passed, the lessons of 1952 would inform environmental movements across the globe. Cities far beyond Britain would study London's dark week, drawing cautionary lines between industrial advancement and the health of their citizens. Laws and treaties emerged internationally to address air pollution, driven in part by the stark example London had provided. What began as a local disaster became a catalyst for global change. By the dawn of the 21st century, London stood transformed. The skyline, once crowned with smokestacks, now shimmered with glass towers and clean-lined silhouettes. The air, though far from pristine, carried fewer burdens. Yet the memory of those lost, the thousands who had perished quietly in parlors and hospital beds, unseen casualties of invisible poisons, remained an indelible part of the city's conscience. The Great Smog of 1952, though shaped by weather and worsened by negligence, had not merely passed with the wind. It had left behind a legacy written in law, in collective memory, and in the commitment of future generations to guard against complacency. London had learned, painfully and irrevocably, that while fog might roll in with indifference, the choices of those who govern and those who live within great cities determine whether that fog becomes a passing veil or a silent executioner. And so, with every clear winter morning that followed in the years ahead, as sunlight cut easily through the air and Londoners hurried about without masks or fear, the city itself stood as a quiet testament to resilience, to change hard-won, and to the invisible but ever-present truth that the greatest dangers are often those we cannot immediately see.